All right, let's get into answering this main question of Module 2. How did we get the Gospels? We want to understand the process of how we got the text that we have today. So I wanted to start with a quote from Mark Strauss that comes right out of the Four Portraits, One Jesus book that sets us up to begin this answering this question. He says this: historical criticism seeks to trace the traditions about Jesus from the earliest preaching of the apostles to the completion of the written Gospels. So that quote essentially summarizes our goal for Module 2, right? We want to understand how is it that we got from the preaching of Jesus to the Gospels that we read today. So to do that, we first want to talk about the 4 stages of development. If we understand these 4 stages of development that the Gospels went through, it gives us a sense of how we got what we have today. So let's talk about these 4 stages. Okay. The first stage here is simply the events themselves. So when we think about the events, what we are focusing on here is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. These are the key events, of course, that the Gospels record. His life, which includes his teaching, his relationships, everything that Jesus did, his sacrificial death on the cross, and his resurrection. So these are the events themselves. This is the first stage of development. The second stage of development is called the oral tradition. Now here, we're talking about the stories, teachings, sayings, and parables of Jesus that were passed down by the disciples and others through word of mouth. So it was once those people were around who heard and who had witnessed these events, what were the things that they said? What were the stories? What were the records? What were the accounts of the things that they said and that they passed down through the oral tradition? What were those things? That's the second stage of development. The third stage is called the written sources. So with the written sources, with stage 3, what we have is a written record of the oral tradition from those who were trying to record and preserve everything about the life of Jesus that they could. So those who heard all about what Jesus taught, what he said, and what he did through the oral tradition, those were captured, written down, and recorded and trying to get preserved so that they could be passed on and shared. That's what stage 3 is about when we talk about the written sources. And then finally, number 4, we have the gospel accounts themselves. So with this 4th stage, what we have is the organized compilation of the written sources into orderly and purposeful accounts of Jesus's life and ministry. Okay, so that was probably a lot. Let me put them all together on one slide so we can see how they relate to one another. Okay, so here they are again. First, we have the events themselves, the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. Following that is the oral tradition, what was said, the stories that went around, the people who witnessed the events and who heard from those who were witnesses. Number 3, the written sources, those who wrote down what they heard from the oral tradition. And then finally, we have the gospel accounts themselves, the organized compilation of all the written sources into an orderly, purposeful document that gives us a full picture of the life of Christ. Okay, so those are the 4 stages of development. We start with the events themselves, followed by the oral tradition. Then we have the written sources that record the oral tradition, and then we have the gospel accounts that organize the written sources. So those are the 4 stages. Now, with each of these stages, we also have a method of study. So there are 4 methods of study that we need to know about, as well as the stages themselves. So let's look at those next. So the 4 stages of development. Now remember, of course, it makes sense that each stage sets up the next stage. So the events themselves set up the oral tradition, which then sets up the written sources, which then, of course, provides the content for the gospel accounts. But each one of these stages has a corresponding method of study, essentially asking, how did this particular stage actually work? So let's talk about those for a second. The first stage is called historical Jesus research. And what this does is that this seeks to understand the historical facts behind the Gospels. So this one is very interested in what actually happened around the events themselves. How do we know what actually took place versus what was later maybe considered legend or made up by those down the line? That's what this particular method of study is intending to discover, the historical facts behind the Gospels. With this second tradition, the oral tradition, The corresponding method of study is called form criticism. And what this essentially is asking is it's trying to understand how exactly the oral traditions were passed down in the early church. How did this actually take place? That's what form criticism is intending to discover. When we talk about stage 3, the written sources, the corresponding method of study that looks at this is called source criticism. So form criticism looked at how did the oral tradition happen. Source criticism seeks to understand the sources used for the Gospels and their relationship to one another. And then lastly, in number 4, with the Gospel accounts themselves, the method of study that is used here is called redaction criticism. And this essentially asks the question, how exactly did the Gospel writers redact or edit or organize their sources into the Gospels? What was the process they used to create the Gospel accounts that we have today? So those are the 4 methods of study. So again, we have the 4 stages of development, the events themselves, the oral tradition, the written sources, and then the Gospel accounts. And each of those has a corresponding method of study. First one being historical Jesus research, wants to understand the historical facts behind the Gospels. Form criticism wants to understand how the oral traditions were passed down. Source criticism wants to understand what the sources for the Gospels were and their relationship to one another. And then lastly, redaction criticism seeks to understand how the Gospel writers redacted or edited their sources. So, of course, the word criticism doesn't mean it's criticizing. It just means a method of study or evaluation. So these are evaluating or studying or asking questions about each of these 4 stages. And so all of them could kind of fall under this first term that Mark Strauss gave us, historical criticism. Historical criticism kind of means all of those. It means form criticism or source criticism or redaction criticism because, just reading again, it seeks to trace the traditions about Jesus from the earliest preaching of the apostles to the completion of the written Gospels. So that brings up another question now that we want to answer in our next lesson. And that question is, what are the Gospels' relationships to one another? So let's tackle that in our next lesson.